We always want to keep our eye generally on where we are. We're in the first half of Mark. We've had Jesus inaugurated. We are now beginning his ministry in Galilee. This will continue generally until chapter 6. And we have now in chapter 1 these two themes that are certainly related to each other, but sort of different angles on the same fundamental root idea. The authority of Jesus' word. Mark wants us to be impressed with that from the exorcism of the demon. The authority of his touch is connected with the story of the leper. And we're going to see both of those in a kind of counterplay throughout the text. I want you to notice, though, that in both cases, cleansing is emphasized by Mark. It was an unclean spirit who recognized the Holy One of God and immediately recognized in that Holy One was a threat to the unclean presence of the demon. Now it's an unclean man. He has leprosy. The most famous dramatic expression of the Old Testament code of being unclean is now captured in this individual who breaks every social taboo to come to the very immediate presence of Christ. The law forbade this. He was supposed to stay about 50 feet away from any other person. He breaks the rules. He comes in and in a kind of desperate cry says, if you're willing. He's not sure Jesus is willing. He may be too dirty for Jesus. He kind of expects Jesus may just, grab his robes around him and get away from this guy as fast as possible. If you're willing, you can make me clean. I know you can, but I don't know if you will. You see, is the force of this guy. And Jesus says what? I am willing. And goes beyond that, reaches out and touches him and cleanses him. And so that's what we hear in this whole chapter, is this power, the authority of Jesus by word and deed to cleanse. Traditionally in the Presbyterian Church, we ordain ministers to a ministry of word and sacrament. The Bible knows about that. We got it from a good source. Because we know that the minister of the Word of God is supposed to give us the Word of God, supposed to give us His truth, supposed to fill our minds with an understanding. But we also know that there needs to be touch. The sacrament is touch. This is my body broken for you. Take it, touch it, eat it. The most intimate kind of touch we can imagine. Jesus wants to be touched by us, and he touches us in the sacrament. Baptism gets us wet. We're touched by it, you see. There's something in the event that is also for us deeply significant. And so we're not surprised that Mark chapter 1 highlights both sides, the authority of Jesus' word and the authority of his touch, and we see both of those in play as this chapter unfolds. All right, so they've been in the synagogue. They go home now. As soon as they had come out of the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. This is one of these little Sunday school moments. One commentator made this point, and he said it so eloquently, I thought I'd pass it on to you. The notion that Jesus and his disciples came out of the synagogue into the house. It's nice to be in the synagogue, but at a certain point you got to go home, I grew up, honestly, my very earliest memories of anything at all have to do with going to church. My folks took me to church as a babe in arms. I was in church before I was old enough to know where I was. All through my life, the rhythm of our lives was church on Sunday morning, church on Sunday night, church on Wednesday night. I was in church a lot. So much so that I have to say that little Baptist church that I grew up in almost felt like a second home. I liked going to church as a kid for very different reasons than I like it today. As a teenager, that's where the pretty girls were. That's why I like to go to, I had very mixed motives. I'm just going to be honest with you. But be that as it may, motives aside, that's where I was. And today I love to go to church, don't you? Isn't it nice to have that rhythm in life? And you might almost think, it'd be nice to just live here. Roll out a cot, be in the house of the Lord day and night, but you know what? That's not good for us. And you know and I know that the power of preaching in the church should become the power in our practice the rest of the week. So they left the synagogue and went to the house. And I thought, that's a great little thought from a commentator on that text, so I throw that in for free. But they went to the house of Simon and Andrew. If you happen to be visiting in Capernaum, you will look at the site where that house was presumably located, and you will find this octagonal-shaped ruins of a structure. This is actually a Byzantine martyrium church that was constructed at that site some years later. So that's what you're going to find. However, there has been a little bit of architecture or archaeological investigation of that region, and there's been at least some determination of what the house looked like where Peter lived with his brother. It probably looks something like this. This is not it, but this would be highly typical of the kind of structure that you would find in Capernaum and really throughout much of Israel's region. This was a typical home built in the 1st century BC. It had coarse walls. It had a roof of earth and straw, the kind of thing you could dig through if you were inclined to do so. And of course, we have an occasion in the book of Mark where that is exactly what happens. You have a few rooms that are within the structure, but typically it'll create a kind of horseshoe arrangement with an open courtyard out front. Make a mental note, because I'll refer back to this as we go along. This open courtyard plays, in fact, in many stories that we hear of in the Bible. In fact, when Peter is warming himself at the trial of Jesus in the courtyard, it would have been in a setting like that. He was outside, but in the immediate vicinity of the house of Caiaphas. And that typical architectural arrangement we see really scattered throughout first century Israel. And so this is the kind of place where they lived. Well, Jesus arrives in the home, and we hear that Simon's wife's mother lay sick with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So now we are introduced to the idea that Peter had a family. He had a wife, for sure, at least one child. We have pretty good evidence of that, maybe more. The Apostle Paul, commenting on this point in 1 Corinthians 9, says, doesn't Peter have a right, as he's traveling around in his apostolic ministry, to take along his wife with him, which of course implies strongly that that's exactly what he did. And the other disciples presumably were married, and they probably had family with them as well. We don't hear much about it in the New Testament. It's not one of the primary themes, but certainly here at least we have pretty clear evidence of such a thing. The traditional name that is associated with Peter's wife is Perpetua, meaning forever, like perpetual. We don't know if that was her name, but that's been traditionally assigned to her. He also, at least by church tradition, had a daughter whose name was Petronia, which would mean the daughter of Peter. Not too clever, but that may be the name she had. We don't know. But in any event, this is the family, at least that the Bible itself and very early church tradition implies would be the case. Clement of Alexandria was writing about 150 years later than the Gospel of Mark was written. And he has some things to say about Peter and his family. He says that the wife of Peter was martyred only shortly before Peter himself. He says that as Peter was witnessing his wife about to be taken and martyred, he said these words to her, his last counsel to her as her husband, and the words were simply these: remember the Lord. And you think about how richly meaningful that probably was to her. Remember the Lord. Remember that time that he came to our house for the first time right after exorcising a demon in the synagogue. Remember the Lord. Remember the dinner that he had with us. Remember the time we spent with him. Remember my travels with him as a disciple. Remember our representing him as an apostle through the years. Remember the Lord. And of course, remember the Lord now especially because she is presumably passing through that portal from this life to the next, and she's going to meet this Lord who she has remembered so vividly. And this is the moment, this is the time. Remember the Lord. I hope that's true. Again, this is not in the Bible. This is the history of the church, but it comes from a fairly reliable source. In any event, it's good counsel for us. In the Bible, we hear of something called apostasy. It's moving away or drifting away from our faithful commitment to the Lord. And invariably, apostasy is tied to forgetfulness. We tend to forget. Are you as forgetful as I am? I'm always caught in the alarming moment, the time, the existential incident, and I forget the Lord. I forget that He's taken care of me for 66 years now, and He hasn't let me down yet, so why should I be worried at this particular moment? But so easily we forget the Lord. But Peter's counsel to his wife, which I imagine she fully embraced, was remember the Lord. Well, the mother-in-law is also not named in this text. We would kind of triangulate from the way the story is told that she was probably a widow. She's probably living, as would have been customary, the ancient social security system, with the daughter and the son-in-law there in Capernaum. And Jesus heals her of a fever. One commentator called this a modest miracle. I don't know, I just giggled when I read that. Is there such a thing, I don't know, as a modest miracle? Obviously, there are some miracles in the Bible, in the New Testament, that are much more dramatic. This one is almost communicated in a kind of aw shucks fashion, isn't it? A miracle's a miracle, but in this case, we do have this almost homey feel to it. It has the ring of a personal recollection. You recall that Peter, presumably, is the source for a great deal of what Mark records. He's recording the memoirs of Peter. There's a strong tradition for that. And so this may be the kind of thing that Peter recalled because he was there and had a deep personal stake in this particular moment, and describes it probably with a high degree of accuracy. The fever here is not identified. Mark is not a physician. He doesn't try to give us a diagnostic analysis of it. Interestingly, Luke, who is a physician, gives us an unexpected slant, because he says not that Jesus healed her, but Jesus rebuked the fever, which is the kind of thing you might expect in connection with some sort of demonic activity, but that's ambiguous and somewhat unclear at best. But anyway, the way Mark tells it is rather mundane, and yet it has a rather lovely touch to it. So Jesus came and took her by the hand. Here's the first time now that we have Jesus touching someone. He takes her by the hand. No words are being spoken. He doesn't stand 10 feet back and say, "Be healed." Nothing like that. He just walks over, a very human, pastoral kind of scene. Walks up to her, takes her by the hand, and immediately the fever left her, and she served them. The phrase "took her by the hand" is in the imperfect tense in Greek, and so if we were going to be a little bit more true to the feel, it would say something like this: having taken her by the hand was helping her up, you see. He just walked over, and having taken her by the hand was helping her up, and as if to say, in the process of doing so, the fever left her. Mark is here emphasizing nothing that Jesus said, but simply what he did. He took her by the hand. Touch is very important to Mark. All of the New Testament gospel writers talk about Jesus touching people. Mark refers to it, the shortest gospel refers to Jesus' touch more times than all the rest of them. He is very interested in Jesus' touch. I've kind of given a by title for this series on Mark, the man of action and compassion. Jesus touches us, and there is a kind of compassionate pastoral aspect to it. I was talking with a pastor friend of mine, now retired, and nobody in this room, and by the way, nobody in this church, so just in case you're trying to figure out who it might be, I don't know that anyone would know, but not that it's an embarrassing story, but this fellow was saying to me after some 40 years in the ministry and nearing retirement that he remembered having started his career as a young pastor, being full of seminary, and full of all of the theological sophistication that comes thereby, and he sort of hit the pulpit and hit the ministry with gangbusters and so on, preaching brilliant sermons, and he got a lot of credit for it. He was a very good preacher. But he says as the years went by and as he kind of mellowed, he began to realize that the things that he thought were most important many times weren't. And he said, especially he began to see that many people would come to church and they'd appreciate the sermons and the leadership and worship and so on, but a lot of the folks, especially the older folks, just lived for the end of the service when he would look in their eyes and take them by the hand, and at that moment, the pastor had one human being in all the universe, and it was that person. And he began to realize how deeply meaningful that was to people. To be touched, to be recognized, no words are necessary, just as if he were the eyes and the voice and the touch of Christ himself. And toward the end of his ministry, he began to be very aware of that and much more intentional in his leadership and worship to do that. There was a time in the history of the church when churches generally met in very small locations, houses for the most part, and it was common for the pastor, the leader in worship, to pronounce the benediction from the Old Testament on each person, laying a hand on them to do so. The Lord, in other words, as we're leaving the service, each person would stand with the pastor and he would say, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you peace." And that person would, then the next one would come, same benediction. That works well if you have a couple of dozen people in church. When you had 200 or 300, it took a while, And the change in the practice of the church from laying hands on individual people to the pastor holding up his hands like that is connected to it. It became a symbolic touch. So when the pastor lifts his hands at the end of the service and says, "The Lord bless you and keep you," you're supposed to pretend that you're actually being touched by the pastor, you see, but for practical matters, we've kind of shifted to that element. In this case, Jesus took her by the hand. Immediately, the fever left her. It's the first account of a healing as such in the Gospel of Mark. Last week, we saw him exorcise a demon. I'm sort of putting that in a different class, but this is really the first time that you have a healing. Early in the 1800s, there was a great deal of embarrassment among Christian theologians and so on about these stories of Jesus healing. This was kind of the height of what's called the age of reason, the age of naturalism, the age of natural explanations for things. And the Bible was kind of an embarrassing book because it kept saying things about Jesus healing people, and you have that supernatural element to it. Thomas Jefferson was president at that time. He actually produced his own Bible. Most of you know that, the Jefferson Bible. He went through and tried to snip out. He was the first higher critic, He went through and tried to get rid of all the texts in the Bible that said anything about Jesus healing people and just wanted to have a nice moral instructor, a kind of an ethical teacher. There wasn't much left of his Bible by the time he was done. More sophisticated New Testament scholars than Thomas Jefferson continued the campaign for about 100 years. It was called the Quest for the Historical Jesus. Let's dig past all of this encrusted layers of legend and silly mythological let's get back to the original Jesus who clearly didn't perform miracles. We know that, for Pete's sake. We live in the 1800s. And find out what this Jesus really was like. The strange thing is that as they continued that, the deeper they dug, the more deeply they penetrated to the core texts of the New Testament. What they kept running into was Jesus, the miracle worker. You just couldn't escape it. It's on every page. Even Josephus, who's no Christian, the only main thing he says about Jesus is he was a miracle worker. If that guy lived, he was a miracle worker. That's the best and virtually exclusive evidence we have about him. So this is the first of many, many examples of this sort of thing. And in so doing, Jesus really does, in a sense, put himself in the messianic expectation of the day. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls describing Messiah says, "Then he will heal the sick, resurrect the dead, and to the meek announce glad tidings." A lot of the messianic expectation was misguided, at least with respect to what Jesus actually was, but there was a lot that was correct. And this idea that one would come, a great physician who could heal with a touch, with a word, was certainly part of what put Jesus in the kind of heart of the expectation of what Messiah would be. There's a little tiny subtlety in this text. We wouldn't catch it except that we have to think about it as the story unfolds. Jesus healed this woman on the Sabbath. He came home from the synagogue. He healed her on the Sabbath. Mark doesn't mention it as such here. He certainly implies it. There's no question that's the way he wants us to understand it. But that Sabbath controversy is going to become part of the story beginning in chapter 2. And by the first part of chapter 3, it's going to reach kind of a head. It's going to reach a moment of collision in the healing of the man with the withered hand. So this is just the first little hint of something that is going to become also a very important theme for Mark, and that is how Jesus is now redetermining the call of Christian people, his followers, especially in connection with what's commonly viewed as this day of rest, the Sabbath. What was the effect of the healing? Service. Mark uses a word here that is not in any sense demeaning service, slavish service. He uses the dignified word in the New Testament that is associated with being a deacon. This is your Greek lesson for the day. One Greek word a day. If we keep this up for 100 years, you'll know all the words in the Bible. This is the word diakone. Diakone, from which we get the word deacon. D-E-A-C-O-N. Diakone. In the New Testament, deacons hold a high and holy office of prestige. They are important folks. They do something that the church needs, and they are treated with the highest degree of dignity. And in a sense, at least part of the subtext of this is that she was healed in order that she might serve, and the service is given a very sort of lofty notion. Now, I'm saying all those things about deacons because I happen to be married to one, you know. And now I've been able to see up close and personal all the things that deacons do, or at least kind of see it through that window. I know many of you in this room are or have been deacons. I want to say on the behalf of the rest of us in the church, thank you. Thank you. We need you. You know, the church doesn't need talking heads like me. Can't do anything but stand up and talk, for 40 minutes. What the church needs is people who can do. People who can reach out and touch and serve. That's the glue that creates a community in which we see such evidence of God's grace. And so it is no surprise that Mark adds that little detail here, that Jesus heals her, and the first thing she does is go into the kitchen and work on a pot roast. She's immediately getting dinner ready for these folks, and that is the service that she takes up, and it's a very lofty task indeed. At evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed. Notice again the little detail, at evening. This is the end of the Sabbath. The sun goes down. That's the official end of the Sabbath. Everybody else in town is waiting with bated breath, watching for the sun to go down, because by now the word about Jesus, the reputation of Jesus that sprung out of the synagogue early that day, has spread through the town, a town of maybe several hundred to 1,000 people, and they're waiting, and now as soon as they're free to do so, they go to that house. We hear that all of those who were sick are brought. In the synagogue, Jesus launched his first volley against the gates of hell. This demon, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus says, don't say another word. This is absolute authority over this one. He exorcises that demon and in a sense throws down the gauntlet. Hell has met its match on steroids. And this is the beginning of this moment of Jesus pushing back, and later through his people pushing back those defensive gates of hell. Now, in a sense, what we see is Jesus launching a volley against the effects of the rule of hell. How does the world look now that Satan's been running the place for 2,000 or 3,000 years? Not so good. It looks like a wilderness. People are sick. People are dying. People are diseased. People are miserable. People are bloodthirsty. People are violent. All of these things. The world has become a wilderness, not a garden. And some of the effects of that now are taken on by Jesus, and he begins to heal all who are sick. And we hear that the whole city was gathered at his door. This may be hyperbole, the whole city, but probably not. You remember the arrangement. It would be possible for a good number of people to be in that courtyard area at the door. It's certainly possible for a bunch more folks to be out in the street around the door. We can imagine that there is a good-sized crowd, maybe pretty much the whole population of the town are gathered there. The idea of crowds is common in Mark. Mark will frequently refer to the crowds, and usually with a kind of mixed attitude. They're not benign. The crowds are in some ways a picture of pathos, a picture of confusion, a picture of people kind of just looking like people. And oftentimes it's not a pretty picture at all. They're gathering. They may not quite get who Jesus is. They just hear there's somebody that can do something good and they don't want to miss it, and they're kind of there in this sort of confused mass. From Mark's point of view, often the crowd does more harm than good, creates more problems than it solves. But it creates a picture for us of that which most drew Jesus, the man of action and compassion. The crowds moved him with compassion, we hear, and that in many ways has been the calling card of the Christian movement ever since Jesus first inaugurated the idea. There are many, many stories of this that could be told. One of my favorites is Albert Schweitzer, who you know was famous, of course, because in his day, early 20th century, he was a medical missionary in Africa. Many people thought he was throwing away his life. He went out to this dark place and set up a little modest clinic and saw as many people as he could day by day until he finally died. It seemed to be an assignment of utter obscurity, and yet by the time he died, he was world famous for carrying on this modest little effort there. Well, many people don't know that before he was a medical missionary, he was a very highly respected New Testament scholar. Now, he was very liberal, but I'm going to forgive him, right, for the moment. He did a lot of penetrating analytical work of the New Testament. I don't agree with all the conclusions, but he was a masterful and insightful student of the Scriptures and so on, published widely, was highly respected, and the thing that kept impressing him as he read the New Testament was the crowds. Crowds, so desperate, so helpless, in many ways so misguided. There was one story in particular that didn't involve a crowd, but it was the same idea. It was the story of Lazarus and the rich man. You remember the story. Jesus tells it, recorded in Luke's gospel. Lazarus, this man who's at the door, again that courtyard shape, and he's just outside the gate. And inside the courtyard, the rich man is sitting there. The Bible says he was drinking a latte and reading the Wall Street Journal. It's in the Greek. You got to be able to, And he's, kind of looks with a little bit of a distant pity on this poor character outside. Doesn't have time to do much about it. I mean, he's got important things to do. And the story goes on. Of course, you know how the story goes. But Albert Schweitzer was so touched. And he said he almost had a vision that all of the masses in Africa were Lazarus lying at the door of England. Until finally he couldn't stand it anymore. He abandoned his career as a New Testament scholar, went back to school, became a doctor, and went to meet that need. You see, that has been the Christian movement at its best. That has been what Christian people have been impressed with, and it all begins with a strange, unexpected character in the first century named Jesus of Nazareth, who didn't run away from the crowds, but in fact went into them and touched them. He healed many who were sick with various diseases. He cast out many demons. Mark keeps reminding us of that. Doesn't want us to forget that confrontation with hell. He did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him. We already saw a little hint of that back in the incident in the synagogue. He heals various diseases. It's a broad term covering the waterfront, all of the maladies that have befallen us as a result of the sinful condition we're in. He's competent to handle all of them. No case was too tough. No diagnostic. He didn't have to send someone to the Mayo Clinic. What is this? Before he could figure it out. This was the great physician covering it all. Mark wants us to see there's no contest here. He is the one who is adequate for the brokenness of our human situation. But he doesn't let the demons speak. Why not? Well, you have an intuition of the answer. I'm going to suggest a few, and there's probably others you can add to the list. For one thing, when you don't permit someone to speak, that is a mark of your authority over them. He said, don't speak, and they didn't speak. Be quiet, and they were quiet. And in some ways, that's partly Mark continuing to remind us there's no contest between the power of heaven and the power of hell. Beyond that, however, there was, of course, this whole idea that if Jesus were identified as the Son of God, the Son of David, the Messiah, other terms that floated around, they all had meaning in people's minds, connotations that could be highly disturbing and distressing. Political, military, revolutionary ideas were in people's minds. They were an oppressed people. They were looking for a champion. They were looking for someone who would be a catalyst for liberty. And as soon as titles began floating, people began filling in the blanks as to what those titles mean. And even if a demon says, you are the Son of God or some such thing, people could run off in 1,000 directions. Jesus didn't want that. But maybe in terms of the artistry of Mark and the Gospel of Mark, the deepest reason is because, interestingly enough, Jesus is identified in the first half of Mark by several different sources, but none of them are human beings. None of them are his followers. It is not until the centerpiece, the heart of Mark's Gospel, the Caesarea Philippi confession, that for the first time we hear a human being say, you are the Christ. Before then, the narrator of Mark, who's certainly not there as a player, he's not on the stage, he's narrating it, he tells us Jesus is the Christ. Verse 1, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesu Christu, you see, Jesu, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. He is identified by the Father at his baptism, you are my Son. In you I am well pleased. He's identified by demons, never by a human being. Nobody in the first half of Mark identifies Jesus, gives the identity of him until Caesarea Philippi. This is Mark, the literary artist, because of course what he wants to do in that story at Caesarea Philippi is not simply report for us how certain disciples responded to the question, but he wants us to feel like the finger of the text is pointing at each of us and asking us that question, the most important question, who do you say? Who do you say this one is? So we're going to have to brace ourselves. That moment of interrogation is coming. I'm going to do my little kind of tip my hat to critical scholars. In the early 20th century, a man by the name of William Reed, W-R-E-D-E, wrote a very highly influential book called The Messianic Secret. Again, it was taking a critical view of Mark, especially, saying that what we find in Mark is what he called an adjusted Christology, meaning Jesus had no idea he was the Messiah, never had any hint of that in his head. The followers of Jesus had no idea that he had any such grandiose designs. He was simply probably a decent guy. But later the church, generations later, ramped up a kind of legendary picture of him, making him first the Messiah, then the Son of God, finally deity itself. And the church ever since has been on this sort of misguided notion that Jesus was much more than he actually was. That's part of that quest for the historical Jesus. The reason, therefore, that the book of Mark reports that Jesus was quiet about being the Messiah was because it represents that adjusted Christology. I'm not going to go into more detail in it. I don't embrace that. I think that in fact, has been thoroughly repudiated by competent scholars who have been more sympathetic to what I think this text is actually saying. But I just want you to at least know that theory is out there, and you may run into it occasionally if you do further reading in connection with Mark's Gospel especially. Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daybreak, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Jesus was up late that night. He was healing a lot of people. Even if you're a miracle worker, it still takes time, He'd worked through the crowd, got to bed, probably fell into bed late at night. He's a human being. He has limited himself to the size and shape of a human being. Though he is God among us, he's living his life as true humanity. And that means he got tired, he had to sleep, he had to eat, he had to do all the things that all of us have to do to make it through a day. He fell into bed, but nevertheless, he's up early the next morning looking for a quiet time, and it happens to be early in the morning. Morning is a nice time of day. I don't know what morning is for you. It may be 9 o'clock. That's fine, But there is a notion that your day begins at some time. And the Bible is filled with the idea that the first item of business in our day should be to seek Him. The Psalms are full of this. Early will I seek you. My voice will arouse the morning. You see, that's the idea. That there is something of a practical character, of value, to come first of all in the day to the presence of Christ. It was a quiet place. It's a desert place. The word that's used for desert here is the same word that's used in the temptation account. The Spirit drove him into the desert. Well, now Jesus seeks the desert, a quiet time, a quiet place, and a quiet renewal. That's how the day gets going for the most balanced, sane human being that ever lived, and if it was good enough for him, it was probably good enough for us, So he starts the day with prayer and this quiet kind of solitude, and that's what gets him, in a sense, charged up, if I can put it in those terms, for the day. Martin Luther said, without 3 or 4 hours of prayer in the morning, I'd never get all the things done I need to do. I hope that was exaggeration, But sometimes what I know about Luther, I think it may be true. The man was up early. He was a man of prayer. And all the things that he had to deal with day in and day out, the attacks on him, and so on, I can imagine that it took a fair amount of time in prayer. I haven't quite met that standard yet. But anyway, the lesson is there. Well, prayer is another of these themes that we're going to find scattered through Mark. Here, Jesus is praying in a lonely place. Jesus prays in the hills in chapter 6. Jesus teaches prayer as a prerequisite to exorcism in chapter 9. Jesus calls the temple in Jerusalem a house of prayer for the nations. Jesus teaches on prayer along with faith and forgiveness in chapter 11. But he criticizes prayer for show. He criticizes those who simply pray to be seen, and we are familiar with that. He urges us to pray in private, in secret. That's the place of true prayer. He exhorts watchful prayer, not sleepy prayer, but wide awake, alert, thinking about who I am, where I am, what God is bringing into my life. The most dramatic example of prayer is, of course, Gethsemane. Please take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And then immediately after, he finds his disciples sleeping them and encourages them to pray. Prayer is sprinkled through the book, so every time I have an excuse, I'll try to say something on that topic. Well, Simon, Peter, source of this story, presumably, and those who were with him, go looking for Jesus. They searched for him. Mark uses very energetic language. It would be the idea of followed hard after him, as if to say, this guy's not going to get any peace. What, are you out here praying? Don't you know there's stuff to be done? That's almost the impression you get. Peter is very self-effacing. He never comes off heroic. He always comes off as kind of a guy that messes up. And you can almost believe that he was the one who gave these stories to Mark. Because in this case, for example, you really do see this idea that here's Jesus with this quiet moment, a quiet time away, just a little peace and quiet. And there's Peter out beating the bushes. Jesus, where are you? Hey, kind of disturbing the atmosphere. And when they found him, they said to him, everybody's looking for you. The word for seeking here. Everybody is seeking for you is the word, the Greek word zeteo. It's very interesting. That word is used several times in Mark's gospel. It's never used in a positive sense. It always has a kind of negative feel to it. Everyone is seeking for you. Jim Edwards commenting on this, and I appreciated his insight, he says, the world is filled with people who are seeking a Jesus of their own imagination. Jesus is a popular guy. If I can sort of fill in the content of who Jesus is. Who is Jesus really? Well, people have many ideas about Jesus, and usually they're pictures of him that kind of fit their own mold, their own expectation, their own desires. Far fewer people seek the Jesus who actually is. Jim says, we want a Christ of our own making, not the Christ who actually is. When we invent our own Christ and pursue that, even if we call it Jesus, it is an idol. We need to ask ourselves the question, who is this one? And that's the question Mark will keep putting before us until Caesarea Philippi. Who is this one? And am I really pursuing some understanding of him? Well, Jesus said, let's go to the next towns. Peter wanted to drag him back to Capernaum. He wanted to have another day like yesterday, another big crowds and so on. Jesus says, let's go to the next town so that I may preach there, because for this purpose I have come forth. Jesus is always on the move. He never settles down. He is, as I say, a man of action. He's always getting from here to there. And that's really, in some ways, defining of his whole mission. For this purpose I came forth. The word itself there for come forth is simply exalthon, which means to come out or to exit. And it may be that all he's saying is that's why I came out of town. That's why I left Capernaum, is to move on to the next town. Some commentators take that view. Some, however, see the subtlety in it, that it may not simply be Jesus coming out of Capernaum, but coming out of heaven. This is why I came in the first place, was to go from town to town, not to park in one location, but to continue this ministry. The Christian movement, in any event, is a movement, and we are, as God's people, always moving to the next town, the next stage in growth, the next task, the next risk. There is a movement to the Christian experience. So he was preaching in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and casting out demons. Jesus was not a maverick. He went to church on Sunday. Only in his case it was synagogue on Saturday, but you get the idea. He was not trying to be outside the box. He was not trying to invent. He was fitting in, as it were, to the religious mold of the day at the time. He went to the synagogue. He preached in the customary place. He preached throughout all Galilee. We have him here probably for 18 months to 2 years or so in Galilee. Josephus tells us there were about 200 villages in Galilee. Most had a few hundred people, some had maybe 2,000 or 3,000. Those would be the larger ones. And Jesus seems to have just worked itinerantly from Sabbath to Sabbath, from synagogue to synagogue, from one town to the next. And so we get the impression every week he was in a new town and he went to the synagogue, and that was where he would begin his ministry in that place. We leave off here. We're not going to get to really what is the next kind of dramatic moment, and that's the leper who comes into Jesus' proximity. We'll take that story first thing off next week. So I'd like to just leave you with my Sunday school lesson this morning. 3 little items, hopefully, that we picked up on as we went through them. Let me just remind you of them now. The effect of Jesus healing the mother-in-law of Peter was that she began to serve. We are called to serve, but we cannot serve until we've been healed. We need the healing touch of Christ to enable us to serve the sicknesses of others, and in fact, in some ways, bring to them the healing touch. So there is a place, first of all, of having that sense of Christ touching us. However, you need to understand we have a recurring disease. It's not just a once-for-all deal. We need to be healed, as it were, again and again. That quiet time, that quiet place, that place of renewal. There's a sense in which every morning we need to come into the presence of Christ and seek His healing, His touch, so that whatever healing we are supposed to provide through the day, we're going to be, just as Peter's mother-in-law was, equipped to do it, because He's taken us by the hand and lifted us up. That's what we're looking for in that time in the morning when we come into His presence. But let's be sure when we're there in His presence, we're looking for Christ. We're looking for the Holy One of God. We're not simply looking for our buddy, our friend, somebody that's going to kind of help us out. This is the holy God of the universe. This is the one who deserves and toward whom nothing less will do than our complete and total, unconditional, unqualified surrender of the very guts of who we are, what we have, everything within our life, the whole province, the whole complex of our personhood is surrendered to Him. Paul says, present yourselves a living sacrifice. Nothing less than that is really Christianity. Christianity is for those who say Jesus is Lord and believe God raised Him from the dead. And that word carries within it this notion of an absolute surrender to the one who is indeed our Lord and worthy of that kind of worship and devotion.